there, geometry students. This is Mrs. Hefty here. We're still in section 4.4 and 4.5 part 2. I ran out of time there, so I'm continuing on with our last proof. Let's take a look at this one. I'm given BD perpendicular to AC, and D is the midpoint of AC, and then I need to prove segment AB and CB are congruent. So let's go ahead and dig in here by writing our givens in our first step. And then let's go all the way down to the bottom. There are 7 steps on this one, and we've got AB congruent to CB. So we're talking about triangle congruency proofs. Right now, what I want to do is I want to prove my parts of my triangle are congruent. So step number 6 is going to say, hey, the 2 triangles are congruent, therefore the parts are congruent. So in 6, I'm going to want to have a triangle congruent to a triangle. So if I'm going to do a triangle congruent to a triangle, I'm going to need 3 pieces to be congruent. So let's go ahead and read our givens again, and let's mark down things that we know to be congruent. Some of you right away are looking at the triangles and you're saying, well, the left triangle and the right triangle both have this line BD in common, so I'm going to mark it right away, and I know that is reflexive. So this is BD congruent to BD. If you didn't see that right away and you wrote that later on in 3, 4, or 5, that is correct. It can be anywhere in the proof before the triangle congruent to the triangle. My reason is going to be the reflexive property. And I do need to have a congruent symbol because we're talking about triangle congruency, and I need 3 congruent parts. All right, so I'm reading my givens. I haven't done that yet. BD is perpendicular to AC. So BD perpendicular to AC, when you think of perpendicular, you put those markings right there. Those are right angle markings. So you need to write down that those are right angles. A lot of times kids just go, okay, those 2 angles are congruent. Yes, they are, but you need to communicate first off that angle ADB and angle CDB are right angles. Okay, and why do you know that? Why did you mark those? Because of your perpendicular symbol. So this is going to be definition of perpendicular, and you can use the perpendicular symbol. Now, if you have 2 right angles, then those angles are going to be congruent, and we did, see that in our previous section when we were determining if triangles were congruent. Now, I'm going to write that those 2 angles are congruent. So I'm going to write angle ADB is congruent to angle CDB. Now that is not definition of right angle. Definition of right angle says you have 90-degree angles. This is actually a theorem that we learned in chapter, I think it was chapter 2, where if you have right angles, then right angles are congruent. Both right angles are 90-degree angles. If they're both 90-degree angles, then they're equal. If they're equal, then they're congruent. That's a theorem. So I'm going to just write right angles congruent. Would be fine if you're going to write right angles congruent theorem. That would be all right as well. Do not write definition of right angle. That is not correct. Also, you need to have a congruent symbol. So here's 1 congruent symbol. Here's 2 congruent symbols. I have 1 step left here. I have my number 5 step left, and I'm going to need another congruent symbol. That way I'm going to have 3 things congruent And so then I can say my two triangles are congruent. I have not used D is the midpoint of AC. D is the midpoint of AC, so this piece AD and DC are going to be equal, and then they're going to be congruent. So I'm going to write that down, AD congruent to DC. That is the midpoint theorem. The definition says they're equal. The theorem then jumps to them being congruent, so the midpoint theorem. So now I have 3 parts marked congruent in my triangle. So now my triangle A, B as in boy, D. When I name my second triangle, I need to match my corresponding parts. I started with A, so I must start with C. I went up the hypotenuse, so I must go out the hypotenuse to B, and then over to D. And we've done that, matching those corresponding parts before, so hopefully you're familiar with that. What is your triangle congruency postulate or triangle congruency test going to be? That's side, angle, side. If your triangles are congruent, then the parts of the triangle are congruent. That's the C, P, C, T, C. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we've done a number of triangle congruency proofs. You'll do, I think, about 4 of them in class tomorrow, and then we will continue on with our triangle congruency proofs. So you guys have a great night. Thank you for watching 2 videos, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.